So this was a very interesting study funded by NIHR in a specific call about long COVID. And what we did first of all was identify who suffers any of the persistent symptoms after COVID, things like fatigue, pain, the symptoms that have been listed as associated with long COVID. And then we looked at whether the existing COVID vaccines would prevent the occurrence of those symptoms. We basically took very large data from the UK, from Spain and from Estonia. We were very lucky to collaborate with colleagues who allowed us to do this around Europe. And we basically looked at whether people who had received any of the vaccines had a lower or a higher risk of developing long COVID symptoms. And what we found is a very interesting protective effect against long COVID. So we found there was a 30 to a 50% reduction in the risk of developing long COVID for people who had been vaccinated compared to people who had not received the vaccines. This was a follow-up study that we conducted, again in collaboration with colleagues from other parts of the world as well. We wanted to see whether being vaccinated minimized the risk of having post-COVID complications. We are aware that some of the vaccines have been associated with cardiac risks and blood clot risks, but we also knew that COVID infection itself could cause those events, and we wanted to see whether being vaccinated through a reduction in the risk of severe COVID could also impact the risk of developing post-COVID cardiovascular complications. And what we saw was a very interesting reduction in the risk of those post-COVID events, both thromboembolic, so blood clots, as well as arterial, so heart attacks, strokes, and heart failure. What we have managed to learn from these two papers is that COVID vaccines have the ability to reduce the risk of other outcomes other than infection or COVID hospitalization. What we found here is that they can also reduce the risk of suffering long COVID symptoms, persistent symptoms, as well as having long COVID complications, including cardiovascular events, blood clots, and the likes. So all put together, we've learned additional benefits from the vaccines that were not demonstrated in the initial trials.